welcome back, folks, to our last session of track two on the last day of Summer Community Day. So I'm glad to round this out with a topic that is near and dear to my heart, which is how to not be terrible at writing or how to write good, which is great. I am joined by Justin Gage, who is the head of developer marketing at Amplify Partners. Him and I have worked together in the past on a bunch of technical content. Folks on the ops side might know his newsletter technically. He's a great resource for all of you who are looking to either communicate about what the data team is doing a little bit more clearly or build up your personal brand in writing. So with that, I will turn it over to Justin, and I will see y'all at the end of the session for some Q&A, but feel free to drop anything as we talk.
Right on. Hello, everyone. My name's Justin, as you all know, and I'm going to give a quick talk about how to not be terrible at writing. Blog posts, communicating your work, all kind of stuff like that. This is my first time giving this talk, so it's possible that it won't be very good, but I guess you're all the guinea pigs. A little bit about me in advance on why I'm giving this talk. So I went to NYU and did data science undergrad, but I also did a bunch of writing, which I guess you can do both. Since then, I've worked at mostly early stage technical startups. So every startup I've worked at has focused on a developer or a data scientist as their audience. And I've usually done either data science or marketing roles. So I've built a very random but specific set of skills oriented around creating content and marketing towards technical audiences. And I also, the newsletter that Ali mentioned it's called Technically. It basically breaks down software engineering and data stuff to people who are either not technical or looking to get more technical. I don't know why I have these braggy bullet points. I stole this from another presentation, so sorry about that. But anyway, if you have to put me into a nutshell, it's basically I'm a data scientist and I do writing for a living. So that is how the genesis of this talk. The thing I like to start out with is basically proving to everyone how important writing is. Writing really changed my life big time when I was early in my career, which I have here labeled as non-writer early career, Justin. I didn't really feel settled in my career. I had trouble communicating the stuff that I was thinking. Didn't really have much of a personal brand. Was very, very dependent on my employer, which, is something. And, you just never got that sweet, sweet hit from when your content goes viral. Fast forward to present day, I'm much more of an impactful person as a data scientist, as a writer. I've got a lot more going on. My personal brand is more recognizable and then, just a lot cooler in general. So definitely recommend writing. As a data literate person, there's a lot of stuff that writing can help you out with. The first one it's pretty obvious is just communicating your work effectively to your stakeholders. That's not going to be the main focus of the presentation today. It's going to be mostly about writing blog posts, but I think pretty much all of the learnings or lessons definitely carry over to communicating stuff that you found, research you've done, insights you've gotten. But writing also helps you build your personal brand, which is important beyond the scope of this presentation, but building a personal brand is great. Helps you diversify, helps you be more yourself at work, helps you be more effective. It's pretty good. It'll also help you build your team's brand internally. If you're on a data team at a startup or especially if it's a bigger company, being able to write, communicate what you're doing, talk about interesting stuff will help. Writing also helps you recruit great teammates, talking about interesting stuff you've done in your data stack. And then also documentation. I know that most data teams talk about documentation. I think fewer data teams actually create said documentation. In my admittedly weak attempts when I was a DS at DigitalOcean, most of the docs that I wrote were pretty bad, but as I became a better writer, the docs that I wrote got better. So being a good writer or figuring out how to write, getting into the scheme of it, getting in those reps will help you with all of these different things. And that's why it's important. So most of us don't write though. Makes sense. We're not writers. It's not our full-time jobs, but it's really hard to do. The biggest question I usually get is, well, what the hell am I supposed to write about? What kind of blog posts would be interesting? What would they do for me? Why would I do this? But also making time among your other job demands is really hard. If you've got a dashboard broken that you've got to fix and you've got some VP of engineering, on you yelling why your data pipelines are down, it's kind of like, I'm not really focused on writing right now. So it's hard to make time for it among the demands of a full-time job. And also writer's block is real. I write a ton. I've probably written, 1,000 blog posts or something since I graduated college. And even I fall subject to the writer's block. So that's another reason people don't write. It's kind of hard. The I like to talk about the conversational to formal paradox. People basically want to read things in general, a few exceptions, that are conversational, they're casual, they're energetic. When you've read good blog posts, they sort of sound like some enthusiastic person giving you a talk or talking to you for 5 or 10 minutes about something that they know a lot about. I think that's a great way to consume information. If you were to explain a concept in person, you'd want to sound pretty much like the above. But for whatever reason, a lot of people, when they start actually writing, it just doesn't come out like that. It comes out really overly formal, and there's a lot of big words, and sentences are structured strangely, even though in your brain, the voice that is speaking, if you have a voice, is much more casual and engaging and charismatic. And I don't exactly know why this happens. I think one of the things for me for sure has just been reps, putting more time in and forcing yourself to get comfortable writing and taking that voice in your head and just putting it on paper in exactly the format it is. But this paradox, or whatever you want to call it, is another big reason I think people don't write. Because if you start writing and you look at your writing and you don't like it, you don't like the way you sound, you don't like the way that you've manifested on paper, you're probably not going to want to do it anymore. Writing should be fun. Not necessarily fun like, bungee jumping, but fun in a wholesome way. And it should feel natural. I've definitely found that when I'm writing code and I'm in my flow, whatever you want to call it, writing should sort of feel like that. If you're writing about a topic that you have expertise in and you're passionate about, it should feel like it's flowing, right? Like you're sort of prophesying onto the Google Doc, although that's maybe a bit of an exaggeration. But it takes time to get there. The ability to just, sometimes I think about it like playing an instrument. I've been playing guitar for like 10 years or so. And the first few years, every song, every note was such a struggle. And then over time, though, as you get better and you get more comfortable, you start to be able to express yourself on the instrument in a way that you've never been able to do before. So it's kind of like doing all the hard work early on to get used to writing and figure out your strengths and weaknesses will help you be able to just put stuff down on paper. But writing is very mood dependent. If you're not feeling it, you probably shouldn't force it. But at the same time, if you only wait for the perfect moment when you're always in the zone, your blog post is never going to get written. So there's a balance there, but writing is very, very mood dependent. It's not normal for someone to be able at all times a day in all moods to be able to just sit down and crank out a blog post. So, it's not, don't feel like you have to be able to do that. What makes a good piece of writing? How do I set out to create something that's interesting and good? In my humble opinion, or not so humble opinion, I think writing is pretty much all about storytelling. This is not news. If you read books about how to do fiction writing, etc., you want to follow a story. Our human brains, our lizard brains, have evolved to really need this linear progression of storytelling. If I'm just spewing out a bunch of facts and documentation, it's really hard for the brain to understand, to read, to interpret, and to engage with that. Now, storytelling means there's a linear progression of facts and knowledge building. So if I'm giving you, I have a couple examples of this in a bit, but if I'm giving or writing a piece about how to do something with the MongoDB Node SDK, I can't make any assumptions about what you know unless I explicitly put out those assumptions. And if I'm going to teach someone how to connect their database to your product and then start using it, I want to put the connecting part before the using part. Stuff that seems very basic, but in practice, a lot of people mess up. And my method for storytelling, I usually like to do when I'm getting demos or when I'm writing posts like this, is basically the video game method. And the idea is you want to set up an example persona that your audience can empathize or identify with. So one example is when I made the video for the Reachable homepage, I set up the audience by saying, imagine you're an engineer at Amazon and your customer support team needs you to create a tool that lets them edit user data. And I keep coming back to that character that we've set up, the video game character, and that just makes it really easy for everything I'm going to do in the product, everything I'm going to show off, everything I'm going to teach to fit into something really concrete, and it feels like I'm following a story and I'm learning about a character. I mean, these are just little tricks that I personally like to use when I'm writing. And sort of like your video game character is going to go throughout their world, and they're going to have trials and tribulations, and they're going to learn new things, and they're going to have fights and stuff. That's pretty much what's happening in your blog post. If you're teaching someone how to do something in a framework or how to use a new library or something like that, just think of your video game character, always come back to what the use case is and what they need to do. And even though it's made up, I find that really helps a lot with storytelling. I have 5 things. I think there's probably more of these or fewer, but there are 5 things in the spirit of giving you all a numbered list about how to write good. And I'm going to run through a little bit more about all of these, but quickly. The first is being intentional about your audience and your goal. Good posts are made and written for specific people with an aim to get them to think or feel a specific thing. If you are not intentional about the audience and you feel like you're writing for multiple different types of people, or if you're not intentional about what you want your audience to feel or get after reading your post, it's probably not going to be a very good post. And I have some specific tactics that I use here. Number 2 is creating a complete unit. A good post helps readers accomplish, learn about, feel a specific thing in a complete way. They're not too broad and touching too much. They're not too narrow and only help you with half of what you need to do. Number 3 is organization. Good posts are clearly organized and follow this linear progression of detail that we talked about. Again, a lot of this stuff is going to sound like stuff you learn in your marketing class in college, like, yeah, okay, obvious. But in practice, a lot of people don't do it. Number 4 is visual cues. One of the comments I find myself leaving in Google Docs the most is, this is a wall of 6 paragraphs, but there's a way to split it up into an ordered list or a way to split it up into bullet points. Good posts have a lot of diagrams, lists, bold and italic, using these visual elements to convey emotion and to break things up visually. And finally, maybe the hardest part, and what I think has worked well with the newsletter, is picking the right amount of detail. Picking the right amount of detail always relies on you understanding your audience. There's no substitute for it. But good posts basically pick whatever the right level of depth is for the audience. If you're writing about something, you don't want to go too into depth about Postgres internals or what the retry policy is for a particular API. You got to focus on what you're trying to get your audience to get out of this post and give the requisite level of detail for that. So let's roll through more these in a little bit more specificity. So the first thing is being intentional about your audience and goal. I am of the belief, of course I could be wrong, but I'm of the belief that a piece of content can only be effective for one specific audience. You can't speak to multiple people at once. And I think this is also generally accepted knowledge. If there are any product managers in the audience, feel free to correct me. But I think this is true for products as well. When I've done my admittedly limited amount of product work in my career, the hard thing was always figuring out who exactly the audience is, because it's really hard to build something that works very well for 2 people or for 2 different audiences or for 2 different use cases. I think content's the same kind of thing. It's very hard to write a blog post that's going to be about a technical arena, let's say like data science or full stack development or whatever. It's very hard to write a post in that arena that will be good for a technical person and also good for a non-technical person, unless whatever you're writing about transcends that boundary. So being intentional about that audience is really important. If I'm, for example, if I'm trying to communicate some of the work that I've done, actually an example, when I was at DigitalOcean, the big project they tasked me with was figuring out churn. I spent like 8 months doing research on churn, and I put together a giant presentation at the end. And I got this advice from a coworker. I was certainly not smart enough to figure this out myself, but he suggested having separate presentations for the different audiences that you'd be presenting with too. So the first important person I was presenting the churn research to was the new CFO. And I also had to present it to other groups, to the VP of product and then also to the marketing team. And he suggested basically tailoring these presentations to match whatever audience you're presenting to. So the CFO's priority is very different than the VP of products. VP of products probably want to go more into depth on what products people are using and why and what impact that has on churn. And the CFO might be interested in that stuff, but they also want to know what financial impact this is having, etc. So tailoring your work to the audience is very, very important. It's hard to make a presentation or however you communicate your data work. It's hard to do it well to an audience that's diverse and has very different cares, priorities, etc. And the same thing with writing. If I'm writing a blog post about some framework, it would be very different to write that blog post for a data scientist who probably wants to use and understand and tinker with the framework, versus to a marketer who's probably more interested in understanding what does it mean, what do people use it for, and what matters about it. So you got to focus on one audience, and this is hard because you want your blog posts to be as widely applicable as possible. I understand the inclination to want to make it relevant for everyone, but you can't do that. And this is advice that I find myself giving a lot. At the top of pretty much every blog post that I edit, I ask whoever wrote the blog post to put 2 things. Number 1, who is the audience? And number 2, what do I want them to think or feel after reading the post? And I have an example on the right here. this is just for, imagine basically a blog post that's giving you a beginner's guide to use to probabilistic modeling in PyMC3. So an audience would be data science teams. So boom, I know they're technical. And number two, considering whether PyMC3 fits into their use case. So they have some sort of use case. They're trying to figure out if this is the framework to use. That's the audience. And then what do I want them to think or feel after reading this? I want them to think, cool, I understand PyMC3's strengths and weaknesses now. I can talk about it more intelligently, and I can get a sense of whether it makes sense for my project. But thoughts and feelings can be all over the place. A legitimate takeaway or thought or feeling that you might want someone to have from your post is that you are smart. That's super legitimate. And if you think about thought leadership in general, which I know gets a bad rap, but is actually something I recommend that most of the companies that I work with do. Kind of what you want the reader to take away is, damn, that was an interesting point of view, or that was smart, or that was interesting. So that's a legitimate thought. Another common one, which we hope everyone feels after reading a technical tutorial, is this helped me accomplish my task. I wanted to figure out how to install Docker on Ubuntu 20, and now I know. And that's like as much as you can hope for out of a blog post like that. If you're doing general technical surveys, kind of like, how does this work, or what are the internals of this framework, or how does isolation levels and locking work in databases, where there's no practical, okay, cool, I can now install this, use this, build this server, etc. The goal you want people to take away is, I understand this topic more now, I feel educated. And then when you're doing product marketing, which talking about your product and how to use it, you want people to think, wow, this is a product that's interesting, I want to try it. Or if they're already using it, they might think, this is a cool new feature and I want to try it. But those two things, audience, thoughts and feelings, when you get those down in advance, I think that makes it a lot easier to write something clean, coherent, and tight. Number two, using visual cues to break things up. I understand the irony of me telling all of you this with a blank, basically boilerplate slide with a bunch of bullet points on it. Having said that, I'm going to ignore that irony. A lot of people's inclination is just to dump text into a paragraph. I try not to have more than 3 or so paragraphs in a row without any visual elements in between. So a visual element could be a list, that could be an ordered list or an unordered list. It could be a diagram, a picture, a meme. It could be a header or a subheader. I just find that it makes it a lot easier for readers to digest, and makes it less likely that they're going to skim and start skipping because they see this wall of random, plain text. And I think bold and italics in general are really severely underused. I don't know if it's the New York Times editorial stylistic craze of like 2017 to 2021. I don't know what it is, but people have stopped using bold and italics, and I think that's silly because they are incredibly powerful tools to get people to focus on things, to get people to remember particular things or paragraphs, to convey emotion, and you should use them. I use them very liberally in the Technically newsletter. So I have an example here of a blog post that I wrote for Reachable back in the day. This is just a survey of how to think about isolation levels and locking in relational databases. Yes, I'm trying to show off how technical I am. And on the left side is how the blog post is, how I wrote the blog post. Each one of these paragraphs talks about a specific problem that you might run into when using a database and trying to think about locking. But I gave each paragraph a header, a small header, but a header that gives you a sense of what the paragraph is going to talk about. And is that absolutely necessary? No, but I think that it makes this much easier to read and digest than the version on the right, which is the same thing with the paragraph headers taken away. If you were going to read what's on the right, it would make sense. It would be coherent. It would be interesting. It would give you information that you need. But setting people up with these headers gives a lot more visual diversity to the post, and it makes me feel like I can read a paragraph at a time, digest that paragraph, and I'm not just being thrown a bunch of text. So this is one example, but there are a lot of others that I think get the point across. Number 3 is organization. And again, would anyone here say, actually, yeah, I think writing a disorganized post is better? No, this is obviously self-explanatory. Everyone agrees you should write an organized post. But what does organization actually mean? I think there's 2 pieces of organization. Number 1 is just the obvious legible part of it. I have a header, I have a second header, I have a third header. But I think that ordering an organization can also be implied. meaning the way that you tell your story and develop your idea and what comes first, what comes second, what comes third, what you assume. These are all subtle and implied, but they're legible in a broader sense. And people will read your posts in different ways based on how you order things and make different assumptions. So because of that, I always like to build an outline in advance. Again, this is best writing practice. Do I always do this? No. If I'm writing a persuasive post or something that I'm trying to convince someone of something, I never do an outline. But if I'm doing a technical blog post or if I'm trying to break down a particular technical concept, yeah, I think building an outline is really useful. The outline also helps you create these clear section headers. I cannot communicate how important these are, and people don't do it. I've got a little hierarchy on the left, basically. This is a post I stole from a post I wrote for Planet Scale a couple months ago about how database indexes work. And there's a nested hierarchy of different headers throughout the post. And I think this just gives people a really simple way to understand where am I in the post, what am I about to read about, to skip through a section they don't want to read, to go back to a section they do want to read. Basic stuff, but check boxes that will make your blog post a lot better. And so when you're organizing your post and thinking about what assumptions am I making, what knowledge comes first, what comes last, what level of detail do I give, you want to ask yourself a few questions. You want to ask yourself, what assumptions are you making about your audience's knowledge level? This is a tough one because even if your audience is specifically data scientists, there's a huge variety, probably even at community days today, there's probably big variety of people and how technical they are and how much experience they have. I personally am a very bad data scientist. I'm sure there are many good ones here. If you were to get into Airflow internals, you'd probably lose me. But maybe there's someone else here who is a core contributor to Airflow and is very up to speed with the internals. So when you make those assumptions about your audience's knowledge level, if you go too low, last/lowest common denominator, the experts are going to think you're not very legitimate and they're not going to be interested in your post. If you go too high level and you are assuming a lot of knowledge about different internals that people don't have, you're going to lose people who are less technical. So another reason why being intentional about the audience is important, but at the same time, just a question to ask yourself: what do you need to know to get value out of the section that I'm writing, and then what is the story that I'm telling? As I think good organization is like kind of a it when you see it sort of thing. If you read a post and it makes sense to you and it was easy to get through, you're like, cool, this is organized. Sometimes you'll read a blog post and it just feels weird and stop and start. It's almost like someone would be playing music and then stop for 20 seconds and then play again, or go back to a motif they never quite finished. It just feels like bad music, basically, but it's hard to describe. Number 4 is the right amount of detail. Super, super important. Or wait, this may be number 5. Anyway, one of the things is it's in the details. Your readers are basically trusting you to give them everything that they need to accomplish their goal. If you give them more than that, then you're going to lose them. It's not helping them accomplish the goal. And if you give them less, then they're not going to be able to actually accomplish that goal. So you got to strike that sweet spot. One common misconception here is being concise and not including extra detail does not mean that you shouldn't include interesting technical asides. Just make use of parentheses and footnotes so that your post visually doesn't distract the reader. I have the bit with the meme here is basically it's equally bad to inundate your reader with needless, irrelevant details as it is to give them not enough detail to accomplish their task. Which is part of why whenever I'm editing a technical blog post, I will always actually like if they're trying to, let's say like build some sort of React component, I will always go through it in my IDE and make sure that it actually works, because you'd be surprised. A lot of times you're just missing things, or there's assumptions about your existing IDE setup or packages you've got installed or things like that. But I think technical asides in general, when you're writing for a technical audience, are great. If you're writing something about Postgres, you can assume that a lot of your readers are probably already using Postgres or have been using it for a while. And if there's some interesting aside or historical note or something like that, it's good to include that kind of stuff because people find it interesting. I have an example here as well about how to use the right level of detail. This is from a post that I wrote a couple of weeks ago about how to do basic CRUD operations with Mongo's JavaScript SDK. And on the left side is the paragraph as I wrote it. And on the right side is a paragraph that I added a bunch of more information to. And I just give people a couple of minutes or a minute or so to read this, but The basic idea is I've added in a bunch of detail about how MongoDB handles users on the right. But if you think about the context of this post and what I'm trying to help, again, getting back to what I want the audience to take out of this, I want them to know how to do CRUD with the Node SDK. I could spend paragraphs and paragraphs going into how MongoDB handles users and all the different edge cases and stuff, because I know that stuff. But it's not useful. It's not helping the user accomplish what they came. It's not helping the reader accomplish what they came to the blog post to do. So you want the right amount of detail for what you need to get there, and assume that your reader is smart. And if they're running into user issues, they'll probably search for a tutorial that will help them accomplish that. But there's just too much detail. It just makes this paragraph kind of annoying to read and distracts from the reader experience. Last slide here. How do I get started? This is a question I get a lot. Cool. You've convinced me, Justin. Your extravagant presentation has convinced me that I must be writing because it's good for my personal brand and my team. How do I get started? So first thing is just write one thing. Don't worry about, these 10 blog posts I want to write. I want to be publishing consistently. I want to set up a personal website. Don't do any of that stuff. Don't make sure your eyes aren't bigger than your hands or mouth or whatever that phrase is. Just start with what is one thing that you could write about. It could even be a series of tweets. Like, it doesn't have to be a blog post, but just getting into the habit of writing is pretty much one of the secrets there. Just like anything else. When I wake up in the morning, I don't really want to go for a run. When I get out there and I'm a few miles in, I'm like, oh yeah, this was great. The hardest thing is just getting into doing it, opening up that Google Doc, starting to write some words, putting an outline down. But don't worry about your cadence. Don't worry about how often you have to publish. Don't worry about what other people are going to think about it. Just write a thing and then figure it out from there. The second thing that I like to give, or advice I like to give here, is finding a topic that you care about. I've edited, worked with, etc., thousands of technical blog posts. No, that's no way, not thousands, probably hundreds. Most of the good content I've seen comes from people who care about the topic they're writing about. Now, when your marketing team is putting out top 10 Postgres GUIs for 2020, like, obviously it's going to be hard to find a writer who's passionate about trying out different open source Postgres clients. Goes without saying. But most of the really, really, really good engineering content out there is from professional engineers writing on their personal blogs, because what they're writing about is something they care about, something they're interested in. So you've probably got at least one topic in your life that you care about. It could be a particular data science package that you really like. Maybe you just spent 3 weeks going deep on DBT tests and you want to write about that. But just find something you care about, because that'll make it a lot easier to get stuff on paper. We already talked about audience and goal, but do not forget it. Think about your audience, think about your goal, put them at the top of that Google Doc, and then write an outline, because it will help you avoid writer's block. And then finally, when the inspiration hits, you got to get in there. If you're just feeling ready to go write, you should do that. Be able to block off time, and just, like, when the mood hits, go for it. To reiterate how much I care about the audience and goal thing, I pulled out 2 messages I sent over the past couple weeks where people asked me to edit a blog post, and my responses basically are like, I'm happy to edit this blog post, but first tell me who the audience is and what your goal with the post is. So I'm very anal about it. Anyway, that's the presentation. Thanks for coming. Hope this was helpful, and happy to answer any questions.
Sweet. Thanks, Justin. Also, thanks for all of your proprietary and confidential memes that were in this deck. I appreciate it. We got 3 questions from folks in a couple minutes, or a minute, but your last session, so we can go through this. The first one is from Zach. How often do you do revisions? I'm assuming you do revisions, or do you have peers review before you're posting?
Great question. I meant to put a slide in on this, but it came out a little too controversial, so I killed it. I personally do not have anyone edit my writing. I find editing in general to mostly be subjective values from other people being imposed on your subjective values. And you give a blog post to 8 different people and they'll have 8 different opinions. So if you're a good writer and if you've written before and you feel like the stuff you put out there is genuinely structured, I don't think too much about editing. The one exception is technical editing. So if I'm writing about something that I don't have a ton of expertise in, I obviously want an engineer to take a look at it and tell me this is wrong, or it'd be interesting if you talk about this or something like that. So subject matter editing, I'm very much a fan of, but structure or nitpicking words or things like that, I've always had issues with, especially when at a startup, you'll usually find your work being edited by people who don't write, which is extremely frustrating because it's like, what do you know about this? You're not a writer. But if you are not super confident in your writing, if it's the first few times you're getting out there, and you really want feedback, totally go for it. Just don't have too many people do it, and don't have random people do it. You want your editor to be someone that you trust, someone whose opinion you value, and someone who has a reason for you to believe that the feedback they're leaving is actually good. Whereas a lot of times at startups, it'll just be all hands on deck, a bunch of random people editing your work who don't know anything. Try to avoid that.
Sweet. Yeah, it's a hot take. I yes personally agree with, for other people less agree with. So yeah, it's good. Sweet. We'll ask one other. Have you started writing something without knowing your audience in front and then decided along the way? And if so, how'd that experience go for you?
Oh, totally. Yeah. Um, it's usually with the persuasive blog posts that this kind of stuff happens. If I'm sitting down to write a technical tutorial like that MongoDB one that I mentioned earlier, the audience is pretty clear, right? It's a developer building some sort of full stack app with Mongo. Those posts, it is important to be intentional about your audience, but I think we all know what's happening there. Sometimes though, I'll want to write something that I'm passionate about or a topic I've been thinking about, and I don't exactly know who the audience is, but I'm going to start writing because, like I said, when you've got that juice flowing, you got to just go for it because you never know when it will hit, when the inspiration will hit again. And I'll look at it and I'll like, oh, this actually doesn't really, it wouldn't really be interesting to a data scientist, or this wouldn't really be interesting to someone on the sales team. And then I would adjust it on the fly. So sometimes it turns out good. Sometimes it doesn't. I've also written with the newsletter. I've written a lot of posts that are the same kind of thing or the same idea, but built for different types of audiences. So I wrote a post about one of the things I talk about a lot is technical literacy. So how many of us work with computers but don't really understand the workings of those computers and why it's important to do so. I've written a post about that for my newsletter audience, which are basically completely non-technical, all across startups or finance or whatever. I wrote a version of it for Andreessen Horowitz's blog, where the target was specifically early stage startup employees, and so I catered it towards that. So you very very much these things can change and flux. So if you have the inspiration, don't let figuring out the audience or the goal like hold you back from getting your words on paper, but always come back and make sure that there is a coherent audience and goal after that.
Awesome. Sweet. Well, thank you very much for running us through this. This is a great presentation. I think really useful for everybody in the community. And I have added you to the OA Club, so if folks have other questions about writing, feel free to hit Justin up over there. And I'm also real big into this topic, so feel free to shoot me any questions too. But yeah, with that, that is the end of our sessions for our actionable advice stage for Summer Community Days. There are two kind of fun events happening in the lounge on track one right now. Parker is talking through early career advice for data noobs, basically, and we are also doing a virtual cooking class with a chef. So if you want something that has nothing to do with data, but is just fun to watch, go check that out as a decompression for your Friday. But yeah, thanks again, Justin, and we will see everybody later.